Welcome back. Thank you, Todd Starnes. Yeah, everybody's seeing it. We're definitely seeing it. We'll have more on some elements of what Todd talked about a little later on in the broadcast. Kareem Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on, say it with me, EFR Talk. And we now go to Dr. Mark Calabria. He is the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. And Ben Bernanke, when I need a translator, there are a few people I could call and say, okay, help me out, walk me through it. But when it comes to the issue of housing, not only housing, he does it, the other stuff too. But when it comes to the issue of housing, I go directly to Mark Calabria because housing is part of the foundation of the economic meltdown. And if you understand that the policy is very important when it comes to a policy that would impact the housing market, specifically interest rates and putting pressure on banks, etc. Mark, welcome back. Great to be with you.
Oh, it's terrific to be back. It's been way too long.
Yes, it has, and it won't happen again, by golly, because I have just a ton of questions for you, but I have to open it up with a clip. And the reason I have to open it up with a clip is because Representative Joyce Beatty from Ohio, Democrat, questioned the Fed chair today. And I thought it was really, it illustrated what people feel the Fed should do and what government should do when it comes to housing. She is making the argument, making the case, after she put forth the first part, which was assisting low-income home buyers. She shifts it to say, hey, housing starts stimulate economic growth. And, well, roll it.
Housing is not only being able to purchase the house, but it deals with construction and jobs and employment. So what responsibility do you think those credit unions and banks have to play in this environment that we're in now?
Well, we encourage banks to lend to creditworthy borrowers. We certainly enforce the fair lending laws. It is important that first-time home buyers be able to get credit in order to buy a home. It's important for our economy. There are a lot of things to work on to get the mortgage market in better shape, and you know, we're approaching this both from a monetary policy point of view, which is trying to keep mortgage rates low so that housing is affordable, but also as regulators and working with other regulators to try to solve some of the problems that still exist in extending mortgage credit.
Now, to be fair, I took out a portion of that clip for time purposes where he mentioned the problem with the implementation of Dodd-Frank and some of the challenges that they're facing on reporting. But my question to you, Mark, is you just heard his role as he sees it defined. Why would good credit home buyers and banks need encouragement when it comes to taking on clients ostensibly that would be able to pay back their loan?
You know, there's so much fundamentally disturbing that's buried into that exchange that we just heard, and from both sides of the exchange. Mm-hmm. So let me pull a couple pieces out of it, and you've touched upon one of the more important, which is, you know, this notion of that banks don't want to make good loans. That's what if a bank doesn't make a good loan, a bank doesn't make money. What a bank doesn't want to do is make a bad loan. And so certainly a large part of the decline in the mortgage market we've seen is lending that we saw in the past to subprime. And let's be very clear, subprime is a borrower who doesn't have a very good history of paying the loan back. So, you know, a lot of what the regulations that Bernanke mentioned and such are really sticks to try to get the banks to make essentially shoddy loans. And, of course, the thinking is that the banks will just make it up by charging the rest of us higher rates. But there really is this notion of you're only going to make housing affordable by getting people on the loans they can't manage. And, of course, by extending credit, you know, one of the more fundamental things I thought was wrong with that exchange was it's this whole notion of we make housing affordable by all of us becoming more leveraged. How about we make housing more affordable by just making it easier to build like any other product, and we make more of it, It becomes cheaper. So to me, a fundamental problem here is this notion that we have that somehow housing is more affordable if we simply run up the price of it. If it's fixed in supply and you expand the credit behind it, that just allows people to bid the price up of it, which actually makes it less affordable. So I don't really see a lot of evidence. You go back and look at the top of the bubble when the Fed kept interest rates negative in real terms. That's when housing was the least affordable. So, Bernanke has a record, if anything, of making housing more expensive, not cheaper.
So we have to ask ourselves, what is the answer? Because we're dealing with QE forever, and there's at the top of the hour, I played a clip from Mr. Representative Fincher about talking to a constituent, and the constituent saying to him, hey, look, guy in Tennessee says, look, at some point, these policies, number one, they hurt the little guy. Okay. Two, how are you going to extract yourself from these? And you can begin with the housing market, addressing that question for the housing market specifically, and then go to the greater mark if you would.
Sure. And so, to deal with fundamentally, the issues that drive in the housing market are supply and demand. And so, again, the credit is going to be derived from, how much housing there is available to build. And, builders are still keeping things at supply relatively constrained. We're seeing starts that are still, and actually have declined over the last couple of months, but are still less than about 1 million a year compared to about 2 million at the height. So, certainly in some markets, the Las Vegases and Phoenixes of the world, there still are a lot of what I would call shadow supply, particularly in places like Las Vegas, where it's still stuck in the foreclosure process, and it's not as bad as it used to be. One of the worst responses, and the Fed certainly took part of this, was as the crisis hit, the attitude was, let's just try to keep people in their homes, whether it was responsible or not, and or even in people were not being able to stay in the home. You kept the home locked up in the foreclosure process, and you really did keep the shadow supply. And so, hold
on, real quick, because Mark, you've written about this, but please tell us historically. You're saying the idea of trying to help people stay in their homes, and this is why politicians don't say it, exacerbates the problem. Now, two questions from that. One, historically, do we have precedent? Two, what should they have done? Let them all foreclose?
What we really need to do is have what I would argue sort of a triage or two-stage approach. There needs to be a sense of who in the home is sustainable and who is not. And so if you've run on a patch of ice, you've run in some difficulty, but you can stay in the home, that's one thing. But a number of people where, for instance, even today, the median time to foreclose in a city like Chicago is 1,000 days. The notion that we need to let somebody be in the house for over 3 years without paying rent and that somehow they're going to get back on their feet after that. So again, the kind and humane thing to do is to help people who are in a situation that is unsustainable transition to a sustainable situation. And so keeping them in a house that they can't afford is not sustainable. Now,
who makes that decision? I'm not trying to interrupt you. But who makes that decision? Government?
Well, government has made that decision. Government has made the decision that despite any lack of real evidence that all foreclosures were essentially avoidable, and that if we just, strong on the lenders, that we would keep people in homes indefinitely. And it really, in my opinion, was an attempt to try to build a bridge from one bubble to the next. And so what government was betting on was we'd turn the credit spout back on, we'd flood the markets with easy credit, housing prices would go back up to where they were, and people could ride the bubble again. And again, that's really, it is a bubble mentality of where we try to create wealth, not the old-fashioned way of actually working, actually earning wealth. We try to create wealth by running up asset prices, and you see that now in the stock market. I mean, a lot of the thinking behind the various rounds of quantitative easing is that the Fed would just pump liquidity into the system, and so that money would have to go somewhere, and so that money would be used to bid up asset prices. And so that's why we've seen, that's why we initially saw in the first rounds of quantitative easing very large increases in commodity prices, and so you saw food prices go up, you've seen gasoline prices go up. And that's why you've also seen the stock market, respond, either negatively or positively, depending on what Bernanke happens to be saying that day. And the thinking really is that, we'll just run up asset prices, and you and I will feel wealthier, and we'll go out and spend more, and that will drive the economy. And again, you don't really get wealthier by driving up housing prices. Housing is where we live. It's a basic necessity of life. It's consumption. If you're a renter and you got to save more to buy that house, because, again, you have to sell it to somebody. And if that person doesn't have a house, then they've got to stretch more, and so that means they got to spend less. So, the very notion that we can just somehow continue to run up asset prices and that's going to make us wealthier, I think has been completely fraudulent, has turned out to really hurt America in a very big way. And, to get back to the earlier exchange that we heard from Bernanke and one of the Congress members, is that, to me, what they're missing is this has really hurt the little guy, because it's the little guy who doesn't have assets. If you use monetary policy to drive up the value of stocks, who does that help? That helps people who have stocks.
Big banks.
If you use monetary policy to drive up price of housing, who does that help? People who have houses. People who don't have houses, who are renting, they get hurt by this. And again, despite all of these interventions, here I'll give you a stat that to me I find is almost sort of shocking. A lot of these housing policies, a lot of Federal Reserve policies have really meant to try to close that gap, of home ownership between Caucasians and African Americans. And, it's about, say, 22% difference. It's, between the home ownership rates between whites and African Americans. It has come down by 1 full percentage point in the last 100 years. So all of these policies that we've thrown all of this easy credit at has not expanded homeownership in any measurable way. We have a homeownership rate that is comparable to what it was in 1960 today. So, again, all of these policies just trying to make things cheaper without actually increasing the supply of them, because at the end of the day, it's all about supply and demand.
So, Mark, final question, just because of time. If we're jumping bubble to bubble, we're going to eventually, there's going to be a hiccup. And we've talked about this before. Tell me, is it going to be a hiccup on level with what we saw in 2008, or do we even know? Can we even calculate it because of how deep we are in?
I actually think it's going to be a lot worse. And I certainly would say, you can't ever predict the timing of these things, and things can go off, a lot longer than people would say. And, of course, those of us who claimed that the housing market looked a little off in 2004, 2005 were mocked and made fun of and said, prices will go up forever. And so what I would say, my concern about the next time around is it's not simply going to be a shock to the mortgage system. It's going to be a shock to the sovereign system. Our entire financial market is built on treasuries. And so we all start with the assumption that, what happens in Greece or Italy could never happen here. Well, it could. And if it does, it's going to be so much worse than anything you saw the last time around. And the reason it was bad last time around was because mortgages were everywhere in our financial system, but treasuries are even more everywhere. So we've really built a financial system on sand.
And people need to hear the truth. What I love is you've addressed race, you've addressed basic economics and reality of policies of what truly happens and how it impacts the very people they're, quote, trying to help, and they being politicians. And you do a marvelous job of it, Mark, and we do appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. Mark Calabria, Dr. Mark Calabria, Director of Financial Regulatory Studies at the Cato Institute. Yeah, it's interesting because how many politicians do you hear say what Mark said? No, you don't, but inevitably they're going to realize it, and they probably already do. So why don't they? Well, they act in their own self-interest, and you don't get far with saying, hey, you know what? If you can't afford a home, you don't get a home. And if you can't afford to stay in your home, that too. And I pray for those people, and I pray for the concerns we all have about being able to stay in our homes. But sooner or later, you do face reality. And crisis inevitably yields truth. AFR Talk.